We'll see. So thanks a lot. My name is Gergely. I work at GoDaddy. So basically here, previously I was the co-founder of RisingStack. And today I'd like to talk about Node.js production checklist, which I kind of learned during the past 5 years or so running Node.js applications in production. Before getting into that, I'd like to start with the question. So basically, why should you care at all about this talk? The reason is because most probably if you are running a production Node.js application, you have to provide some kind of an uptime. You may already heard about terms like free nines uptime, which basically just tells how many minutes of downtime your service can have in a given period of time. Oh, it's kind of bad.
Yeah.
So basically, 3 nines of uptime means that your service can be down 33 minutes a month, which is not that bad. Well, depends on your customer's point of view. But most probably you want to do a lot better than that. So you end up with 5 nines. And now things have changed quite a bit. So now you only have 26 seconds of error budget on your hand. So the things that I've just quickly talked about, they are usually called service level agreements, which consists of service level objectives. Like, for example, what kind of response time you'd like to provide for your customers, and also penalties if you don't meet them. No matter if you're building service internally or for your customers, you have customers. If you're running Node.js applications in production, or well, any kind of applications in production, you have customers. So you should really be prepared to come up with some service level objectives for them. And to meet them, I just collected a couple of things that today I like to talk about. So we are going to touch error handling, we are going to touch securing Node.js applications, logging, monitoring, and some incident handling as well. So let's start with error handling. In the past couple months, probably the async await changed the most how we are handling errors in our Node.js applications. And the thing which is one of the most important here, in my opinion, is that we have to learn to throw again. So previously, we used to get to write a lot of callbacks. So basically, if you were writing Express applications, you did something like this. This is a very ugly example. You should never do this. But basically what we are doing here is that we are just checking whether there was a user ID provided to the root handler and try to grab that user from the database. But this example has a lot of problems. First of all, it basically handles errors like right in the root handler. And it's kind of a mess to just use all this res.stand status across your Node.js applications. And what we are going to do is basically going to fix this error handling in our Node.js application quickly. So one of the first things that you can start with is basically creating new error objects in your root handlers and just add some HTTP status code to them. And once you did that, you can already start using the built-in Express Node.js error root handler, which is basically a middleware which has 4 parameters. The first is the error object, and based on that, you can do different responses for your customers. So the thing with that is that just putting this across your code base is not really something that I guess you would be proud of. So instead of doing that, I'd like to introduce a library which you may be already familiar with, which is called Boom. So instead of creating your error objects for yourself, Boom can do it for you. So basically, Boom has most of the HTTP, not most, all of the HTTP status codes implemented. So for example, if there is a missing user ID, then you can just say that it's a bad request. If there is an internal server error, for example, there was some database error, you can just use the bad implementation, which is just an alias for internal. And the last step, before actually we can migrate our root handlers to throw and to use async await, is to prepare Express to be able to handle promises, because by default Express does not do that for us. So what you have to add is an async middleware. Basically, with this you can just wrap your code base your root handlers, and you try to just resolve the promise, and if there was an error thrown, then basically just you call the next callback, express, which is a way to signal express that something went bad. And once we have this, we can simply wrap our root handlers in the following way. So now you can really use async await with express as well. So you can see that if there isn't a user ID provided, I'm simply throwing a bad request using Boom's built-in method. And you can also see that we no longer need to handle the database error, because the get user async will throw by default, which will be code by the middleware that we just wrote. And the very last thing which you have to do is just to modify your error handler function and use Boom's object structure there. So basically we are just grabbing both the status code as well as the payload from the Boom error object. And at the end of the day, probably our code will look a lot more readable. And yeah, you can just use async and await in your Express applications using this technique. Any questions so far about what I've just did? Okay. The next step, the next thing I wanted to show you is what you can do about securing your Node.js applications. Obviously, the first step is with NPM. So if any of you haven't done it so far, you should really enable two-factor authentication for NPM right after this talk, or maybe now. No, now you should listen to me. But after the talk, you should really do that. And the other thing about NPM is that we have a tremendous amount of Node.js modules there, which, well, if you build projects, they can end up pretty quickly a very huge directory in your application. And what's tricky here is that sometimes you don't really know what you are actually depending on, or you just make some mistakes. A couple of months ago, I did a quick experiment, and I just published a module called Express.js. And you can see that it's been downloaded almost 2,000 times in the last month. But what's even worse is that there are actually 5 modules depending on them. That's scary. So basically what I wanted to say with this is you are what you require. So you really should pay attention to what modules you are requiring on. And well, actually there was another module. If you're familiar with bcrypt, so it's quite easy to just miss a couple of letters there. And yeah, that can be quite dangerous too. Or for the Express, if you just publish another module which sends you some information, like for example, authorization headers, I just leave it to your imagination. A couple of software solutions or advisories that can help you mitigate these kind of things, but it's still up. So anyways, so there is a Node security project, which is well, not really solving the issue, just raise awareness of, and Sneak, which basically just they can scan your application's dependencies and tell you whether there are vulnerable modules that you are depending on. Speaking of security, there are a couple of quick wins that you can easily do for your applications. One of them is the security-related HTTP headers. Probably you already know some of them. My new favorite from this list is the DNS prefetch control header. Who knows what this header does? Okay, so the way browsers work, because of performance reasons, is that on a given web page, if they see links for external websites, they just try to resolve those for you. So if you click them, it will be faster. The only problem with this is that from another site's point of view, it can look like that you actually visited the site while you haven't. And this can cause privacy issues for the users. To fix these kind of things, there's a module called Helmet. If your application does not really use it as of today, from tomorrow it should. It comes with the same set of defaults, but basically you can easily configure all the headers I just mentioned and a lot more. And I think this will be the last about security, which is just you should always validate user input. My favorite module here is called Joy. This is the one that Happy.js uses by default too. So basically with this you can just describe how a given user input should look like and validate that. The next thing is about logging. I've seen this in the past year that most applications don't really get it right. So I just wanted to talk a few minutes about that too. When it comes to logging, I think we should have 4 requirements for logging. The first one is that you should always have timestamps to know when things happen. Format. It's really important that your log format should be readable for both for human and both for machine consumers as well. Regarding the destination, you should always you should always log to standard output and the standard error. And the other thing, just to make sure it's easier for you to understand what's going on, is the support for log levels. And let's talk a little bit about log levels. You should have a log level for error levels, which is basically if something went bad, you should report it. So really, when a system is in an unexpected state, which prevents further processing of the events. And the application in this case may try to recover or just simply let the process die and the process manager restart it for you. The next level, which you should also use, is the warn level, which basically tells you that something went bad, but the system can still function. This event should always be reported because mostly these are the kinds of events that usually lead to an error kind of event. The next one is the info, which can be used and should be used to indicate major state changes in your application. So for example, if you have HTTP servers, you should have one for when the server actually just started to start up and when it became operational, and the same for when it stops. And the last one is the debug level, which is for diagnostical level events. And for this, I don't really have a lot of best practices to say about. It should be really in the discretion of the engineer who implements a given module, so how granular information, in their opinion, logging needed. And just to show you a short example about this, so here if you have an Express application, we have an info level when it started to initialize, and we also have an info level when the server started to listen on things. Another really important kind of best practice about logging, which I found in the past years, is if you are building HTTP servers, you should try to log the original URL of a given error. This just makes it easier for you to track down where it failed. Speaking about HTTP and HTTP services, it's okay. I briefly wanted to talk about Graceful shutdown as well, which is really important if you deploy applications frequently and you want to make sure that requests are not dropped. So your application in this case should listen on SIGTERM, or basically this unique signal which the process manager uses to tell the process that it will be shut down. And in this case, your application should stop accepting new requests, but still finish the ones that's ongoing. And after that, just clean up the resources it uses. So it can be file descriptors, it can be database connections, basically any resource that your application is using. At GoDaddy, we just recently fixed this kind of things, and we open sourced this module. This is called Terminus. You can find it on our open source GitHub page. It basically works with any HTTP servers, so no matter if it's Express or Happy, it works with them. It's built on Stoppable, which is basically just a small utility that extends the built-in HTTP server so the close actually just closes once all the ongoing requests are finished or we reach the timeout. And to integrate it with your application, yeah, probably you don't see it from the back. It's on GitHub, you will find it. The next thing, now as we have some running applications, is about monitoring. Let's start with a few metrics which is really important to watch for. The first one is error rate, because it really directly affects your customers. So if your page just sending 500s, your customers are not your customers, they won't buy anything. The latency, studies shows that the longer the response time of a given application is, the more likely your users will just go away. Throughput is really important because this is how you can put both the error rate and latency in context, and saturation just tells you if you can handle more traffic or not. Speaking of monitoring, this is from one of the most popular Node.js monitoring products. I'm not saying what the name of it, but I guess you know. So you can see that it's just showing us the average response time for the given service. This is the chart you should never look at, and the reason is the following. This is from the very same application. So you can see that we have 3 routes, cars, trucks, and health check. I think that the users won't be calling the health check endpoint. So from user's point of view, it's actually like 3 times slower than the average response time. So when you are looking at your metrics, you should really look at the routes which are really used by your customers and not by some automated checks. And this kind of monitoring is called white box monitoring, because with this we actually install an agent into the application itself. But sometimes it can happen that even if this product shows that your app is up and running, it's not the case and it's not accessible for some users. And because of this, you should also use a technique called black box monitoring, which basically, by practice, just pings your application from different regions of the globe and just tells you what the response time from a given region is. But also, no matter how well you are doing with monitoring, it will happen that your application will go down. And yeah, so this is why we just started to do this principle at GoDaddy as well, is that if someone builds a service, they will run it too. And as we see, it really encourages ownership for a given service, so teams will really think about how hard it will be to run their applications in production, and it just leads to operational excellence, which leads to more satisfied customers. But if things go really bad, then that's the time when we should talk about disaster recovery. So disaster recovery, disasters can really happen for both natural as well as some human error. And disaster recovery basically includes tools and policies around how you recover from these problems. Lately, what we have started to do in our team, as we are running a lot of Kubernetes, we run most of our services in Kubernetes. We added Ark, which is an open source project from a company called Heptio. And basically what Ark helps you with is disaster recovery, migrating between clouds, and if you'd like to have a production-like environment for both development and testing. And the way Ark works is basically that it runs a service in the Kubernetes cluster itself, just grabs all the Kubernetes objects, push them into S3, or if you're using Google Cloud, I guess they have a blob store as well. Sadly, I don't know the name. And you can just define how frequently you like to make your backups. And if something goes bad and you have to restore the whole cluster or some services, you can just say Ark, restore, create, and your application will be up and running with a single command in a few minutes. And I think it's really impressive. And that was it. Thanks a lot for listening. I will be around if you have any questions. Probably we'll have time for some. Yes, of course we are hiring too. Just talk to me or Silas somewhere in the white and black. Yeah, there's the guy. And I will just put the talk, the slides into the Meetup group, and I collected a few resources which I've used to put together this talk. Thank you. Questions? Questions? Whoa. Maybe I should just, yeah, in the meantime, go ahead.
So you mentioned like unstable when you have unhandled section maybe in a Node app and you need to stop Node.
Mm-hmm.
Like how often do you see that really happening, right? Because in your experience, does that happen in production?
Yeah.
Like, and I'm really mean kind of generally across the Node app ecosystem.
I can speak only from my experience. Usually, so the question was how often unhandled exceptions actually happen. Usually what I seen in the past is that they happen only if there was some really program error or just there was some unhandled database connection problems. So usually, I wouldn't say it's common. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for that. Okay, yeah, so I will be around. Just say hi, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Well, did you call those people up who accidentally included your internet down? Did you let them know?
No, I haven't yet. I should.
Really, that's on them. Seriously, seriously, check your spelling before you npm install stuff. Just do that. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks.